How did a medieval university student lose their spot? Was it for a bad grade on a Latin exam, for sleeping through a philosophy lecture? Or was it for something far wilder, something that would shock students today? In the centuries between the 1100s and the 1500s, student life was a brutal, often dangerous game. Number 7. Student brawls and the blade. The halls of medieval universities, often crowded with young men, could explode with violence at any moment. Students, many of them from noble or well-off families, carried daggers and even swords as part of their everyday attire. They felt a sense of honor, a quickness to defend their reputation, or simply a need to settle disagreements with force. It was not uncommon for an argument over a game of dice, a perceived insult, or even a dispute over a shared meal to escalate rapidly. A shouted word turned into a shove, then a punch, and then, all too often, a flash of steel. University statutes across Europe consistently punished violence. The University of Paris, a hub of intellectual life, had strict rules against students carrying weapons or engaging in fights within its jurisdiction. Yet, the incidents continued. A student named Thomas from Normandy, studying at Paris in the late 1200s, was known for his quick temper. Records from the Bedel's Court, the university's own judicial body, describe an incident where Thomas got into a heated argument with a fellow student, Robert, regarding a philosophical point during a discussion after a lecture. Words turned into a physical scuffle. Thomas, feeling his honor slighted, drew a small dagger he kept hidden in his tunic. He lunged at Robert, inflicting a shallow but noticeable cut on Robert's arm before others intervened. The university authorities were swift. Thomas was immediately apprehended. The wound, while not fatal, was considered a serious offense under the university's rules against drawing blood. The rector convened a special council. After a brief hearing, Thomas was declared expelled. His name was struck from the rolls. He was ordered to leave the city of Paris within 3 days, under threat of further punishment from the civic authorities if he lingered. His academic career ended abruptly, a consequence of his violent outburst. He returned to his family's estate, his scholarly ambitions shattered. Another case, recorded in the Liber Decanorum, the Book of Deans, at the University of Bologna in the 1300s, involved a group of law students. Bologna was famous for its law faculty, attracting students from all over Europe. These students, often older and more independent than those in Paris, were not immune to violent tendencies. One evening, after a long day of lectures, a group of students from different regions of Italy were enjoying themselves at a local tavern. The atmosphere was boisterous. A student from Naples, a fiery young man named Giorgio, boasted about the superiority of Neapolitan jurisprudence. This drew the ire of a student from Venice, a proud scholar named Marco. A verbal battle ensued, escalating quickly into a general brawl involving several students from both factions. Chairs were overturned, and punches flew. Giorgio, in a fit of rage, picked up a heavy tankard and struck Marco on the head. Marco fell to the floor, bleeding. The town watch, alerted by the commotion, soon arrived. The university authorities were immediately informed. The severity of Marco's injury, though not life-threatening, was a clear violation of the university's peace. The rector and the college heads held an emergency session. Giorgio, identified as the primary aggressor, was brought before them. Despite his pleas, the evidence was clear. He was expelled from the university. His name was posted publicly as a warning to other students. He was forced to abandon his studies and return to Naples, his hopes of becoming a respected jurist vanishing in a moment of drunken fury. The university sent a formal letter to his family, informing them of his expulsion and the reasons for it. This was a deep shame for his family. These expulsions were not just about punishing individual students. They were also attempts by the universities to maintain some semblance of order in often chaotic urban environments. The reputation of a university depended on its ability to control its student body. Chroniclers of the period frequently mention the turbulent nature of student life. For example, The anonymous chronicler of the Abbey of St. Albans described student gangs roving the streets of Oxford in the 14th century, engaging in nighttime skirmishes. These groups, often organized along regional lines, used the darkness to settle scores. A student caught participating in such a gang fight, especially if injuries were inflicted or if weapons were used, faced severe penalties. The university would often collaborate with the town authorities, meaning that expulsion could be followed by imprisonment or even banishment from the town itself. The student's path to a professional life, whether in the church, law, or medicine, was abruptly closed. The shame of expulsion followed them, a mark of their failure to adhere to the discipline required for scholarly pursuits. The university's power was absolute in these matters. The decisions of the rector and the assembled masters were final, leaving no room for appeal. Students learned often the hard way that the pursuit of knowledge required more than just intelligence. It demanded self-control, respect for authority, and an absolute avoidance of the blade. Number 6. Disrespecting the scholars. In the medieval university, the master or professor was a figure of immense authority and veneration. They were the custodians of knowledge, the interpreters of ancient texts, and the guides to wisdom. Students were expected to show profound respect, bordering on deference, to their teachers. This respect was not just a matter of good manners, it was a fundamental part of the academic hierarchy. Challenging a master's authority, insulting them, or disrupting their lectures was considered a grave offense, an assault on the very foundation of scholarly order. Such acts were not merely impolite. They undermined the entire system of learning and teaching. Classroom itself was a sacred space, a place where profound truths were discussed and debated. Students who disrupted this environment or openly defied their instructors faced swift and harsh consequences. The statutes of almost every medieval university included provisions for punishing insubordination. One famous account from the University of Paris in the early 1300s tells of a student named Pierre de la Roche, known for his clever but arrogant demeanor. Pierre was a student of logic and theology, a bright mind, but one that often bordered on insolence. During a particularly complex lecture on Aristotle's metaphysics, Master Jean, a respected and elderly scholar, was explaining a difficult passage. Pierre, rather than listening quietly, began to whisper loudly to his neighbors, making sarcastic comments about Master Jean's interpretation. When Master Jean paused, Pierre, instead of remaining silent, suddenly burst out with a loud, mocking laugh. Master Jean, a man not easily rattled, stopped his lecture. He fixed his gaze on Pierre and calmly asked him to explain what he found so amusing. Pierre, emboldened by the attention, then openly scoffed at Master Jean's explanation, declaring it to be old-fashioned and confused. The other students in the room were stunned into silence. Such open disrespect was almost unheard of. Master Jean, his face reddening, immediately stopped the lecture and ordered Pierre to leave the room. The next day, Pierre was summoned before the rector and a committee of masters. Master Jean recounted the incident, emphasizing Pierre's open mockery and disruption. Other students who witnessed the event were called to corroborate the story. Pierre, still defiant, attempted to argue that he was simply expressing a difference of opinion. However, the university authorities saw it differently. They viewed his actions as a direct challenge to the master's authority, a flagrant disregard for the sanctity of the lecture hall, and a disruption of the learning process for all students. The decision was unanimous. Pierre de la Roche was expelled from the University of Paris. His name was recorded in the university's disciplinary book, a permanent mark against his record. He was effectively barred from studying at any other reputable university in Europe. His family, who had invested considerable resources in his education, received a letter detailing his expulsion, a source of immense disgrace. Pierre's sharp mind, could not save him from the consequences of his sharp tone and disrespectful attitude. He left Paris with his academic dreams in tatters, a cautionary tale for his peers. Similar incidents occurred in Oxford. The registers of the Chancellor's Court in the 15th century contain records of students being disciplined for insolence. One particularly detailed case involved a student named John, a quick-witted but often ill-mannered young man. John was known for engaging in debates with his tutors outside of formal discussions, sometimes pushing the boundaries of polite disagreement. One afternoon, during a tutorial session with a senior master, John became increasingly agitated when the master corrected his interpretation of a legal text. John raised his voice, interrupted the master repeatedly, and at one point even accused the master of ignorance. The master, shocked by this outburst, warned John about his conduct. John, however, continued to argue, his face flushed with anger. He refused to acknowledge the master's authority. The master, seeing no immediate change in John's behavior, ended the tutorial immediately and reported the incident to the Chancellor. Chancellor's Court was not a place for light-hearted discussion. It was a serious judicial body. John was summoned. The master provided his testimony, describing John's disrespectful language and refusal to accept correction. John attempted to mitigate his actions, stating he was passionate about the subject. However, the court did not accept this as an excuse for open insubordination. The verdict was clear. John was declared to have committed a grave offense against academic decorum and the authority of his master. He was expelled from the University of Oxford. His matriculation papers were withdrawn. He was given a short time to gather his belongings and leave the university town. His academic career ended before it could properly begin, a direct result of his failure to respect the very scholars who were meant to guide him. These instances highlight the rigid social structure within medieval universities, where the master's word was almost law, and any challenge to it carried severe repercussions. The path to knowledge was paved with humility, not arrogance, and those who forgot this learned it a harsh lesson. Number 5. Dice, drink, and disorder. Medieval universities were places of intense study, but they were also places where young men, far from the watchful eyes of their families, could indulge in various vices. Gambling, excessive drinking, and general disruptive behavior were constant headaches for university authorities. These activities were not just seen as distractions from study. They often led to debt, violence, and a general breakdown of order within the university community and the surrounding town. University statutes across Europe strictly forbade gambling, especially for money. Drunkenness was also heavily penalized, as it often led to other offenses. The authorities understood that a student immersed in such activities was not a student focused on the pursuit of knowledge. The student population was often drawn from wealthy families who supplied their sons with ample funds. This money, intended for books, tutors, and lodging, often found its way into taverns and gambling dens. Records from the University of Bologna in the 14th century frequently mention students being disciplined for ludus alii, the game of dice. One notable case involved a student named Filippo, a promising scholar of medicine from a wealthy Florentine family. Filippo, however, developed a strong addiction to dice. He would spend hours in the back rooms of taverns, risking his entire allowance, and often borrowing money from other students or even townspeople. His studies began to suffer. He missed lectures, failed to complete assignments, and became increasingly agitated and desperate. His tutor, a stern but observant man, noticed Filippo's decline and his frequent absences. The tutor eventually discovered Filippo's gambling habits. He reported it to the university council. Filippo was summoned. He initially denied the accusations, but witnesses from the town, including tavern keepers and students he owed money to, provided testimony. It became clear that Filippo had accumulated significant debts through his gambling. He had also been involved in several noisy disputes over unpaid bets, disturbing the peace of the neighborhood. The university authorities viewed his behavior as scandalous and detrimental to the university's reputation. They also saw it as a moral failing that directly interfered with his academic progress. The council deliberated. Despite Filippo's pleas and promises to reform, the evidence of his persistent gambling and the debts he had incurred were overwhelming. Filippo was expelled from the University of Bologna. His expulsion was not merely for playing dice. It was for the severe disruption his addiction caused, the debts he amassed, and the total disregard for his academic responsibilities. His family was informed of his expulsion, a profound disappointment for them. Filippo, stripped of his academic privileges, had to return to Florence, his medical ambitions lost to the roll of the dice. Similar stories emerged from the taverns of Oxford. The university city was teeming with alehouses, and students, often far from home, found solace and entertainment there. The University of Oxford's Chancellor's Court regularly heard cases involving drunken students. In the early 15th century, a student named Richard, known for his jovial but often reckless nature, became a frequent visitor to a particular alehouse near his college. Richard would spend late nights drinking with other students, often engaging in boisterous singing and shouting, disturbing the sleep of nearby residents. One night, Richard, heavily intoxicated, got into a heated argument with the alehouse owner over the bill. The argument escalated into a physical confrontation. Richard, in his drunken state, smashed several tankards and broke a window before the town watch arrived to restore order. The university authorities were informed of the disturbance and Richard's involvement. Richard was brought before the chancellor. The alehouse owner testified about the damage and Richard's unruly behavior. Other students present corroborated the story of Richard's drunkenness and the ensuing chaos. The chancellor listened intently. Richard was accused not only of drunkenness and damaging property, but also of bringing disrepute upon the university through his disorderly conduct. The university had a clear policy: persistent drunkenness and public disturbances would not be tolerated. Richard was found guilty. He was formally expelled from the University of Oxford. His name was removed from the college rolls, and he was ordered to pay for the damages he had caused. He was given a short period to leave the university's jurisdiction. Richard's academic career, which had begun with such promise, ended amidst broken tankards and shattered glass, a direct result of his inability to control his drinking and his disruptive behavior. The universities recognized that such behavior was not just about personal indulgence. It directly threatened the academic environment and the fragile peace between the university and the town. Students who could not maintain a semblance of decorum and sobriety were simply not welcome. Number 4. Challenging the sacred texts. Medieval universities were deeply intertwined with the church. Theology was considered the queen of sciences, and all other disciplines, from law to medicine, were ultimately subservient to it. The teaching of Christian doctrine was central to the university's mission. Therefore, any challenge to established religious dogma, any act of blasphemy, or any promotion of heretical ideas was considered an extremely serious offense. Such actions were not merely academic disagreements. They were seen as threats to the spiritual well-being of the students, the university, and potentially the entire Christian community. Students were expected to uphold orthodox beliefs and to study the scriptures with reverence. Cases of heresy or blasphemy were rare, but when they occurred, they were handled with utmost severity. The stakes were incredibly high. An accusation of heresy could lead not only to expulsion, but also to excommunication from the church, and in extreme cases, even to a trial by the Inquisition. The universities often acted as the first line of defense against such perceived spiritual dangers. The University of Paris, with its prominent theology faculty, was particularly vigilant. In the late 12th century, a student named Simon of Tournai gained a reputation for his brilliant but sometimes unsettling intellect. Simon was a master of logic and rhetoric, and he applied these skills to theological questions in ways that some found alarming. He was known for asking difficult questions during lectures, questions that seemed to challenge the very foundations of Christian belief. One particular incident drew the attention of the theological faculty. During a public disputation, a form of academic debate, Simon presented arguments that seemed to deny the literal truth of the resurrection of Christ. He used complex logical reasoning to suggest that the resurrection could be understood metaphorically, rather than as a physical event. While such intellectual exercises were often encouraged, Simon pushed the boundaries too far. His arguments were deemed to be dangerously close to heresy. Theological masters, fearing the spread of such ideas among the student body, quickly moved to censure him. Simon was summoned before a special tribunal composed of the most senior theologians and the rector. They questioned him rigorously about his beliefs. Simon, confident in his logical prowess, defended his interpretations, but his defenses were seen as evasions, not sincere explanations. The tribunal concluded that Simon's views were indeed heretical, and that he was actively promoting them among his peers. The judgment was swift and severe. Simon of Tournai was not only expelled from the University of Paris, but was also publicly condemned as a heretic. His books and notes were confiscated and ordered to be burned. He was forbidden from ever teaching or engaging in theological discussion again. The severity of the punishment reflected the gravity of the perceived offense. Simon's promising academic career was utterly destroyed, his intellect deemed a dangerous tool rather than a gift. He disappeared from the historical record, his fate a stark warning to any student who dared to question the sacred texts too boldly. Another example can be found in the records of the University of Oxford in the 14th century, a period marked by significant theological debates. A student named William was accused of making blasphemous statements in a private setting. William was known for his cynical wit and a tendency to speak irreverently about religious matters, even mocking saints and sacred rituals in casual conversations with his fellow students. While these remarks were initially dismissed as youthful indiscretion, they eventually caught the attention of a more zealous master. The master reported William's conduct to the chancellor. William was called before the chancellor's court. Several students testified, recalling specific instances where William had made derogatory remarks about the Eucharist, the Virgin Mary, and other sacred aspects of the Christian faith. William attempted to argue that he was simply engaged in intellectual jest, but his defense failed to sway the court. The university authorities viewed such statements as a direct assault on the core tenets of Christianity and a grave example to other students. They considered it an act of public blasphemy, even if made in a seemingly private context. The chancellor, after consulting with the theological faculty, declared William guilty of severe blasphemy. William was expelled from the University of Oxford. He was ordered to perform public penance before leaving the town, a humiliation designed to underscore the seriousness of his offense. He was denied any further academic pursuits and faced the social stigma of being labeled a blasphemer, a mark that would follow him throughout his life. These cases illustrate the absolute power of the Church's doctrines within medieval universities, and the dire consequences for anyone, especially a student, who dared to challenge them. Pursuit of knowledge had strict boundaries, especially when it came to faith. Number 3. Seeking forbidden pleasures. Medieval universities were almost exclusively male institutions. Many students were expected to pursue careers within the church, which often meant taking vows of celibacy, or at least living a life of chastity while studying. Even for those not destined for the clergy, the moral code of the time was strict. Engaging in sexual misconduct, particularly with prostitutes, or cohabiting with women, was severely prohibited. Such actions were seen as moral failings, a corruption of the student's soul, and a source of scandal that could tarnish the reputation of the university itself. The universities sought to maintain a high moral standard among their students, seeing it as essential for intellectual and spiritual growth. Proximity of young men, often with money, to the lively urban centers where universities were located created opportunities for such forbidden pleasures. University statutes often contained specific clauses forbidding students from frequenting brothels or living in sin. The University of Paris, a city known for its vibrant and sometimes licentious atmosphere, was particularly watchful. Records from the 13th century detailed the case of a student named Henri, a young man from a respectable family studying canon law. Henri, instead of focusing on his studies, began frequenting the city's less reputable districts. He was known to spend many nights in brothels, squandering his allowance and neglecting his lectures. His increasingly disheveled appearance and frequent late-night returns to his lodging eventually drew the attention of his college master. The master, acting on rumors and his own observations, conducted a discreet investigation. He discovered that Henri was not only a frequent visitor to a specific brothel, but had also accrued significant debts there. The master presented his findings to the rector. Henri was summoned before the university council. He initially denied the allegations, but the evidence gathered was compelling. Witnesses from the town, including a brothel keeper who testified, confirmed Henri's habitual presence and his unpaid debts. The university authorities were gravely concerned. They viewed Henri's actions as a serious breach of moral conduct, a public scandal, and a direct threat to the spiritual well-being of the student body. The council deliberated. The decision was firm. Henri was expelled from the University of Paris. His name was removed from the rolls, and he was ordered to leave the city. His family was informed of his disgraceful conduct and his expulsion, a source of profound shame for them. Henri's promising legal career ended before it had truly begun, undone by his pursuit of forbidden pleasures. A similar situation unfolded at the University of Bologna, where many students were older and perhaps more prone to seeking female companionship. While some students married, cohabitation outside of marriage was strictly forbidden and seen as a moral transgression. In the 14th century, a student named Lorenzo, a brilliant but rebellious scholar of rhetoric, began a secret relationship with a local woman. Their relationship escalated, and Lorenzo, defying university rules, began living with her in a small house on the outskirts of the town. This arrangement, though initially clandestine, soon became an open secret among some of his peers and, eventually, attracted the attention of the university's proctors. The proctors, who were responsible for student discipline, received reports of Lorenzo's cohabitation. They conducted an investigation confirming that Lorenzo was indeed living with a woman, a clear violation of university regulations concerning student morality and communal living. Lorenzo was summoned before the rector. He was confronted with the evidence. Lorenzo surprisingly did not deny the relationship, but argued that it was a private matter that did not affect his studies. The university authorities, however, disagreed vehemently. They considered cohabitation a serious moral offense that brought disrepute upon the university and set a poor example for other students. They also argued that such living arrangements were a distraction from academic pursuits and a challenge to the moral framework of the institution. The rector, after consulting with the college deans, ruled that Lorenzo had engaged in scandalous and morally corrupt behavior. Lorenzo was expelled from the University of Bologna. He was ordered to vacate his residence and leave the university's jurisdiction. His academic journey, once full of potential, was halted abruptly. He was forced to abandon his studies and his ambition to become a master of rhetoric, a consequence of his choice to seek forbidden pleasures and defy the strict moral code of the medieval university. These expulsions underscore the profound emphasis placed on moral purity and disciplined living within these ancient academic institutions. Number 2. Thefts, scams, and midnight schemes. Students in medieval universities, while often from privileged backgrounds, were not immune to financial desperation or plain opportunism. Theft, Fraud and engaging in various scams were serious offenses that undermined the trust within the academic community and the wider town. Such crimes were not just seen as violations of the law. They also brought shame upon the university and its student body. Universities, often having their own judicial powers, were quick to punish students who engaged in such illicit activities. The integrity of the student population was important for the university's reputation and its relationship with the townspeople. One common problem was the theft of books. Books were incredibly valuable in the medieval period, meticulously copied by hand and often worth a small fortune. They were essential tools for study, and their theft was a grave offense. Records from the University of Oxford in the 14th century describe the case of a student named Thomas, a poor scholar who struggled to afford the necessary texts for his studies in logic. Thomas, driven by a combination of need and desperation, began to steal books from other students' chambers and even from the university library. He would then sell these stolen texts to illicit book dealers in the town, often for a fraction of their true value, using the money for food and lodging. His scheme went undetected for a time. However, a student whose rare illuminated manuscript was stolen reported the theft to the university proctors. The proctors launched an investigation. They visited the known book dealers in the town, inquiring about recent sales of specific texts. One dealer, fearing the university's wrath, confessed to buying several books from Thomas. Proctors also found some of the stolen books in Thomas's own meager room. Thomas was immediately apprehended and brought before the chancellor's court. He confessed to the thefts, pleading poverty as his motivation. The chancellor acknowledged his difficult circumstances, but emphasized the gravity of his crime. The theft of books was a direct attack on the very resources necessary for scholarly pursuit. It was a breach of trust within the academic community. Thomas was formally expelled from the University of Oxford. He was also ordered to make restitution for the stolen books, a debt he could ill afford. He was given a short period to leave the town. His academic career was brought to an abrupt end, not by a lack of intelligence, but by his desperate acts of thievery. His poverty did not excuse his criminal actions in the eyes of the university authorities. Another form of deception involved scams and fraud. Students, sometimes seeking quick money or a way to avoid debts, would engage in various tricks. The University of Paris records from the early 15th century detail a particularly audacious scam perpetrated by a student named Julian, a modic and manipulative young man. Julian, known for his persuasive speaking abilities, began to forge letters of credit from wealthy patrons, claiming to be authorized to receive funds on their behalf. He would then present these forged letters to various merchants in Paris, obtaining goods and money under false pretenses. He used the proceeds to live a lavish lifestyle, far beyond his actual means, impressing his peers with his apparent wealth. Julian's scheme worked for several months, until one of the merchants, growing suspicious, sent an inquiry to the supposed patron. Patron denied ever issuing such a letter of credit, exposing Julian's fraud. The merchant immediately reported the matter to the city authorities, who in turn informed the university. Julian was arrested by the university's beadles and brought before the rector and a panel of masters. The evidence of the forged letters and the merchant's testimonies was overwhelming. Julian initially tried to charm his way out of the situation, but his eloquence failed him. The university authorities were appalled by the extent of his deception and the damage he had caused to the university's reputation in the city. His actions were seen as a blatant disregard for honesty and integrity, qualities deemed essential for any scholar. Julian was expelled from the University of Paris. He was also handed over to the city's secular court for further punishment, facing potential imprisonment or even banishment from the city for his extensive frauds. His brilliant, albeit crooked mind led him not to academic success but to disgrace and legal trouble, a direct consequence of his elaborate schemes and deceptions. These cases highlight the harsh reality that medieval universities were not just places of learning, but also strict moral institutions that severely punished any breach of trust or law, especially when it involved financial dishonesty. Number 1. The town gown bloodshed. Perhaps the most dramatic and dangerous reason for expulsion was involvement in the infamous town gown riots. Medieval universities were often powerful institutions with special privileges, including their own courts and exemptions from civic laws. This often created friction with the local townspeople or townsmen, who resented the students' immunities and sometimes their arrogant behavior. Small disputes could rapidly escalate into full-blown street battles, often involving hundreds or even thousands of combatants. These riots were brutal, resulting in injuries, deaths, and widespread destruction. For students participating in such riots, especially when they involved violence against townspeople or property damage, was a guaranteed path to expulsion, and often much worse. The universities, while protective of their students, also needed to maintain some level of peace with the towns they inhabited, as their very existence depended on it. One of the most notorious town gown conflicts occurred at the University of Oxford. The St. Scholastica Day riot of 1355 is a prime example. This began over a dispute in a tavern. On February 10th, two students, Roger de Chesterfield and John de Croydon, were drinking at the Swindlestock Tavern. They complained about the quality of the wine to the taverner, John Croydon. An argument ensued, and the students threw the wine in the taverner's face. The situation quickly escalated. The students struck the taverner and then left, threatening further violence. The townspeople, already resentful of student privileges and frequent disturbances, gathered in a mob, armed with bows and arrows. The students, hearing of the gathering, rang the bells of the University Church of St. Mary the Virgin, calling their fellow scholars to arms. What began as a tavern brawl exploded into a full-scale riot. Students, many of them armed, poured into the streets, confronting the townsmen. Fighting raged through the streets of Oxford for 2 days. Houses were burned, shops looted, and many people on both sides were injured or killed. The university authorities were desperate to restore order. When the dust settled, and royal intervention eventually brought an end to the bloodshed, the university was forced to take drastic action against its own students. Many students were identified as active participants in the violent acts, including those who had initiated the conflict or engaged in severe attacks on townspeople. Roger de Chesterfield and John de Croydon, the students who started the initial dispute, were among the first to be targeted. They were not only expelled, but were also handed over to the royal authorities for criminal prosecution. Their names were permanently removed from the university rolls, marking them as outcasts. Beyond these initial instigators, many other students were caught up in the fury. The university's chancellor and proctors, under intense pressure from the crown and the grieving town, began a systematic review of student involvement. Students who were found to have physically assaulted townsmen, engaged in arson, or participated in widespread destruction of property were identified. The records show numerous expulsions in the aftermath of the St. Scholastica Day riot. For example, a student named William of Leicester was specifically cited for leading a group of students in an attack on a baker's shop, resulting in significant damage and injury to the baker. William was summarily expelled. His academic future was completely destroyed. Another student, Robert of Nottingham, was expelled for using a longbow to shoot arrows at townsmen from a rooftop during the peak of the riot. These expulsions were not just disciplinary actions. They were also a desperate attempt by the university to appease the crown and the town, proving that it could control its unruly population. The university's privileges were at stake. The involved students lost their right to study and were often banished from Oxford, their academic dreams extinguished by the flames of the riot. Another significant town gown incident occurred in Paris in 1229. This riot also began in a tavern. When students were denied better wine, the students began to destroy the taverner's property. the provost of Paris. The chief royal officer intervened, and his men, without seeking university permission, attacked the students. 2 students were killed. The university, enraged by this violation of its privileges and the deaths of its students, retaliated by suspending lectures and scattering its masters and students to other cities. This act of dispersion was a powerful protest. When the university finally returned after 2 years, under direct papal intervention, severe conditions were placed on both the town and the university. As part of the reconciliation, the university was compelled to purge its ranks of any students identified as instigators or active participants in the initial riot or subsequent acts of aggression against the town or royal authority. For example, a student named Giles, known for his leadership in student gangs, was specifically accused of organizing an attack on the provost's men, resulting in injuries. Giles was brought before a special tribunal. Despite his defiant stance, the evidence of his active participation in the violence was clear. He was expelled from the University of Paris, his name marked as an instigator of unrest. He was barred from entering the city again. Another student, Henry of Brussels, was identified as having participated in the destruction of property during the initial tavern dispute and subsequent attacks on townspeople. He was expelled and forced to leave Paris. These expulsions were not just about individual punishment. They were also about restoring a fragile peace between the university and the surrounding community. Students who chose to engage in such mass violence found themselves stripped of their academic status, often facing severe civic penalties, their scholarly pursuits ending abruptly in the chaos of the streets. Town gown riots stood as the ultimate example of how student life could turn from intellectual pursuit to a brutal fight for survival, with devastating consequences for those who crossed the line.